We're privileged today to have an address by Jason Kuchel. Jason, I had a call early this morning to say that Jason was sick in bed, but I managed to persuade him to come, so he's crawled out of his sick bed to be here today, which is genuine commitment. It's the sort of thing you'd expect from a former local government officer who, in the dim dark past, was a local government engineer extraordinaire. He's since gone on and been involved running a number of industry and advocacy groups, and has been for the last 7.5 years with the Chamber of Mines and Energy. Now, mining, as we all would know, is absolutely critical to the future of this state. It's one of the it's a sort of a no-brainer that this is an issue that we all have a deep interest in. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Mines addressed the club on his perspective in relation to the future of mines. I'm comforted by the fact that as a politician you now want to hear the real story, but also not many people were able to hear him on the day. So we're privileged today to have Jason with us. So would you please welcome Jason Kuchel.
Oh, I'm glad to see the duck is up here. I was told this would be squeaked if I went overtime. You could have it now. No, in reality, I said I'd keep talking until Stephen stood up beside me, which I knew that would be time to finish. Thank you very much, President Peter and Stephen, for inviting me today. I'll try not to move around too much in front of that thing so that I stay within screen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you all today. I should have, if I'd realised that Tom Kutsantonis had spoken only a few weeks ago, I would have perhaps got on to check it and see what he'd talked about so that I either wasn't covering exactly the same things and telling you the same things you'd already heard, or either that or totally contradicting him, one or the other. What I would like to do is try and give a little picture of what I see as the real story of the resources sector in South Australia, as it stands at the present time. I've always found that the government, there's always a certain amount of hype. It's always based in a certain amount of truth, but there is often some hype about what is happening. And alternatively, the media is either hyping it up or it's terrible, one or the other. You can't have a sort of an average story which says yes, mining is doing okay, thank you. That's not exactly front page news. But often in the absence of reporting too, people start to wonder, does that mean the mining sector or the petroleum sector aren't doing very well? What does that mean? Is it all falling to pieces? What's actually going on? I'll just start a little bit by telling you who the Chamber of Mines and Energy is. As Stephen said, I joined 7.5 years ago. We had about half a dozen staff back then. We've got 17 today. It's just one little indicator of how the industry has grown, but it's also an indicator actually of how much advocacy is required, because things have certainly moved quite significantly in the industry, and there's a lot more of South Australia that's affected by it. We represent over 300 companies. We have all the producers in minerals mining, oil and gas production, as well as most of the junior explorers who are looking for minerals or petroleum, and many service providers as well who collectively make up the industry. Our job, of course, primarily is about lobbying the government, but it's also about doing things like today, getting the message out there about what's happening in the industry, talking with the community and media and the like. So we have a broad range of things that we do, and I'm not going to go into all of that because I've only got a very short period of time today. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of the size of the industry, the total value of the resources sector in South Australia is around $7.5 billion annually. Of that, and mostly made up of minerals I should add, we export nearly $4 billion worth of product annually. That's around 40% of the state's total exports currently, and that's when we're actually having good agricultural exports at the present time. And that has risen quite significantly in the 7 or so years that I've been with SACOME, it was down in the teens back then. We set ourselves a target as an industry of achieving 50% of the state's exports by 2015. We're almost at 2015. We didn't say whether it was the beginning of 2015 or the end of 2015. But nonetheless, we'll be getting very close. I don't think we'll quite make 50%, but considering that we were down a little over, or I think it was a little under 15%, to where we are today, that's quite a significant achievement for the industry, but perhaps more importantly, very significant in terms of the economic contribution to the state. Government often tends to talk more about minerals, although that's changing quite a little bit as minerals is struggling a little bit more at the present time and oil and gas is doing quite well. But oil and gas as a commodity in terms of production comes in third behind copper and iron ore respectively. But petroleum in its own right produces $1.56 billion worth of or contribution to our gross state product each year. However, that is set to grow. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about petroleum now and come back to minerals. But in terms of petroleum, most of you would know about the Cooper Basin. It's been there for a long time. There's been a lot of production there for a long time. But you only have to go back about 3 or 4 years ago, and most people thought that the Cooper Basin was pretty much running out of oil and gas, that it had a life, maybe 10 years, and then it sort of got extended out to 20 and then perhaps 30. Now no one's talking about a life for conventional oil and gas. And unconventional oil and gas, which, by the way, there's nothing unconventional about the gas. You can still put it in your cooker at home and it's still going to burn the same way it did before. What's unconventional is the rocks within which it is found. And it's probably actually the industry's fault that we called it unconventional gas, because it seems to have this tainted meaning, particularly amongst the anti-fossil fuel campaigners. It's about what that might mean. But as I said, what it simply does mean is that it comes from the rocks that we're not used to getting oil and gas from. And that has more than doubled the life of the Cooper Basin, or alternatively means that we might see over the course of the next decade a doubling of production out of the Cooper Basin. As you can appreciate, being that that's where almost all of our oil and gas comes from at the present time, that would see another $1.5 billion or so in contribution to the state each year. In addition to that, we have exciting opportunities other basins. There's the Arkaringa Basin, which is in its early stages. That's also up in the northern part of our state. And we also have offshore opportunities in the Bight. BP at the present time have commissioned, it is currently under construction, a $500 million rig that will be used in the Bight. It'll be finished later this year and will be, later next year, and will be floated out, and they'll begin more further exploration through drilling in the Bight. And they're going to be spending something in the order of around $500 million a year just in exploration expenditure. There are a number of other companies out there as well, multinational companies, and they'll be itching to get their hands on that rig whenever BP are not using it. You don't just go out and spend $500 million if someone else has got one you might be able to borrow. But that rig will be used constantly. Now, a little bit like mining, it actually takes, of course, some time to actually get production when you're talking about offshore oil and gas. Of course, when you find it onshore, your exploration well is often your production well, and away you go. Offshore is a little bit different, and your guess is probably as good as mine as to how long it'll take, but it'll probably take longer than a decade before we see production out there. But we will certainly see many hundreds of millions of dollars being spent annually as we ramp up towards that potential in the Bight Basin. And we're already seeing companies being awarded contracts such as support contracts like helicopter support, for example, out of Ceduna, which, perhaps not surprisingly, has doubled the size of the Ceduna airport. And they have some of the most expensive, long-range, capable helicopters that you'll find anywhere in the world now based out of Ceduna just to support that exploration. And BP are also spending money in Port Adelaide, and they'll be spending it around our state in different places to support that particular exploration. In the southeast, we also have some opportunities in the Otway Basin. That's been coloured very recently by, particularly through the election process. We saw the anti-fossil fuel campaigners very successfully convince some of the locals down there that it was going to be the worst thing in the world if oil and gas exploration was to be allowed, as if it had never ever happened there before, and that it would contaminate their water supply, ruin the landscape, and that the southeast would be forever changed and it wouldn't be the same place that it has been. Well, apart from economically speaking, I suspect that it wouldn't actually change all that very much, because in actual fact we've had oil and gas exploration in the southeast for more than 100 years, very seriously now for more than 50 years, and we've had oil and gas production down in the southeast for a period of around 2 decades. That did shut down early last decade, but nonetheless oil and gas production in particular, gas plant, gas-fired power station that was using the gas from that plant, pipelines, all the rest of it has all been down in the southeast for quite a long time, and it seems that was conveniently forgotten. Again, what was talked about was that this was different because this was unconventional gas, and what was different is because they were going to use fracking. That's an F word that's similar to something else. But it does actually sound like it's a really bad thing. And hydraulic fracturing is the technical term. And hydraulic fracturing, whilst that might sound new, and most of those anti-fossil fuel campaigners would have you believe that it's new, it's actually been used for decades. We've been using hydraulic fracturing in conventional oil and gas for over 30 years in this state, and it's been well regulated and well understood. It's actually used in more than 90%, in fact somebody told me more than 97% of oil and gas exploration and production wells around the world. So there's nothing new about it at all, but it all sounds terrible. That's the way those people who want to run a negative campaign would have you believe. So in the southeast we actually had the Liberal Party unfortunately suggesting that they would, not suggesting, but committing to having an inquiry into fracking, and it's something that we think would damage the industry quite significantly. Not because the outcome would be anything that we would be concerned about, but simply the process that goes through, and that brings up, gives an opportunity, it gives a soapbox, if you like, to all those people who would like to see the industry shut down. And recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've had Mark Parnell introduce a bill into Parliament to actually stop all fracking, to actually have a moratorium on fracking until there'd been an inquiry. Funnily enough, though, if you read the fine print in the bill, it actually says even once they've got the outcome of the inquiry that fracking wouldn't be allowed to be continued anyway, so it's not a moratorium, it's actually a complete ban on fracking. And funnily enough, the only time that fracking was okay was for geothermal energy. And whilst we obviously support it for geothermal energy, and we have some members that are in the geothermal space, geothermal energy, the fracking, the hydraulic fracturing that's used, the stimulus is 5 to 10 times greater than it is for oil and gas. So the Greens aren't seriously concerned about whether or not fracturing is going to affect the environment or aquifers or anything else. They're purely using that as a means to stop oil and gas production. So, having said all that, though, the message there, of course, is that it's not easy sailing, but certainly there are very significant opportunities in the oil and gas space in South Australia. To touch on minerals, we are still moving forward in the mineral space. It is a lot harder, particularly harder to raise capital. If you're a junior explorer and you don't have a deposit of any significant value, then trying to raise capital in today's market is extremely difficult. We have been working with the federal government on a program called the Exploration Development Incentive, which would actually pass some of the tax credits that a company earns, that of course they can't get any of that back from the government until they actually have some taxable income, but they would actually be able to pass that back through to shareholders. So if you like, that gives the shareholders an effective dividend, and dividends are something which is very much attracting investments regardless of the sector that they're looking to invest in at the present time. So we would hope that that would actually help the junior exploration sector. If you're a big miner, of course, and you perhaps don't need the money from someone else, then you can still move forward. Having said that, the share market, often if you're looking to invest significant sums of capital, tends to beat you around the head a little bit, and your share price is often reduced. So there is some reluctance by some of the bigger miners to spend money at the present time. If you're in between, perhaps you might have a significant sized project, but you're a junior, you don't have a lot of capital yourself. It is very, very tough to raise money at the present time. We do have some good projects that are going ahead, such as Valence's graphite project, just a little bit north of Port Lincoln. That project is in the investments in the tens of millions. They're moving ahead, no problem getting tens of millions. We expect Havilah with their gold project, which was announced just yesterday, which is northwest of Broken Hill. It will also be in the tens of millions. Again, we expect that that will be able to get their investment relatively easily. That is by the way, I should say that was their mining lease approved yesterday. They've still got some more approvals processes to go through over the next 12 months. But nonetheless, that's a project which should proceed. And we've also got some other graphite, silver and gold projects which are of a relatively small scale. And those are the projects probably that are going to be the most interesting and worthwhile. And I see Stephen making his move already. If you're in the next category up, where you're needing hundreds of millions of dollars, a little bit more difficult, but potentially doable. Where it's quite difficult at the moment is if you've got a project worth billions of dollars. And this is an area where the government can particularly help in addressing some of the infrastructure issues, because most of those projects that have billion-dollar price tags, often greater than 50% of that expenditure is in infrastructure. And if your project isn't perhaps quite big enough to justify the infrastructure in its own right, that's quite difficult. I could give you a little lesson on how investors like to actually see their returns, and often that additional infrastructure makes it hard to give the investors the returns that they're expecting out of a regular mining project. But suffice to say that infrastructure, which I think that the government finally understands, is important and critical to the resources sector, and they're finally working on port solutions and rail and power and water. These things do stand to transform South Australia's economy, and as one of the only industries that has a real opportunity to bring South Australia out of the economic doldrums, we would hope that they move on that very quickly, and that they actually make the tough political decisions to make that a reality. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason. Jason, in last month's edition of In Business, you had an article about what appeared to be saying that South Australia has a bit of a Roxby Downs fetish. I wonder if you'd just explain what you meant by that.
Sure, some of you might have been disappointed I didn't mention Roxby Downs. And I should say, by the way, that BHP Billiton is still moving forward with a plan which I think is a much more sensible plan, and I don't have 5 minutes to explain all of that. But what I find is that any time that BHP Billiton announces that they're doing anything towards Roxby Downs, is that I get rung up by about 10 different media outlets, and they're all excited and they're all wanting to write a big story about it. And they tell me it's because all the South Australians want to hear about that. And I do understand, because of the hype that it's been afforded over a period of time, why that is the case. But the reality is, when we actually have a look at the rest of the minerals projects put together, they stand to bring just as much benefit, if not more benefit, to South Australia, economically speaking. And in fact, because of their size, often it's much easier for South Australian homegrown companies to actually reap more of the benefits from those projects, that in my view it's not the place that we should be focusing. It's not to say I don't want to see Roxby Downs expanded. We absolutely want to see that's the case, and we support BHP Billiton in their efforts to do that. But when we look at all the rest of those mineral projects, and that's not even including all of the petroleum projects, if as a government, as I was saying before about infrastructure, they have the opportunity to more readily make some of those projects come to fruition, or at least advance them, bring them forward. And there's really nothing that they can actually do about Roxby Downs. The number of federal parliamentarians who have asked me about what can they do to bring Roxby Downs forward, I'm afraid, guys, there isn't anything you can do. But there are other projects that can be brought forward that can bring the economic benefit to South Australia.
Any questions? Okay. Members, I think we've been treated to a very useful insight to what is obviously a very important sector in South Australia. I mean, the statistic quoted of the contribution to South Australian exports from going from 15 to 50% is quite a significant shift, and it just shows the developing importance of this industry that really cranked up, I think, about 15 to 20 years ago, when a lot of exploration got underway. So it's obviously a very interesting subject, and we're not just a one-trick pony in relation to mining and energy in South Australia. Would you please join with me in thanking Jason for his talk?